The sun had barely risen, and already the heat pressed down on the wooden streets of Dry Creek, making the air shimmer like a mirage. Maribelle wiped the sweat from her brow and gripped the doorframe tighter, her knuckles white against the rough pine. She had been summoned before the sheriff at dawn, an uncommon and unsettling honor. Her stomach twisted, and her pulse hammered in her ears like the galloping hooves of an approaching herd. She could smell the mingling scents of pine, dust, and sweat hanging thick in the air, a reminder that life in this frontier town was never gentle. Sheriff Callahan's office smelled of old tobacco and ink, and the sunlight cutting through the cracked blinds painted slanted stripes across the room, illuminating a thick layer of dust on the floorboards. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, eyes narrowed, studying her with a kind of intensity that made her feel exposed under a microscope. The faint creak of leather boots against the floor echoed with a weight that made her heart squeeze tighter. "You'll go," he said, voice low and firm, carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "And you'll treat him." Her lips parted, and she could only manage a faint, trembling, "Him?" He didn't answer. Instead, he slid a crudely drawn map across the desk, its edges frayed and darkened from years of handling. A trail etched through the canyon led to a spot marked with a red cross, the notation barely legible. Maribelle traced it with her finger, the wood grain scratching her skin. "Jahi," she whispered, tasting the name on her tongue. "Fiercest Apache alive," the sheriff said, leaning back in his chair, the creak of leather punctuating his words. "You're the only one with the skill and the courage to do this. Everyone else is too afraid. Too many have tried and failed." Maribel's stomach lurched. She had heard stories, every whispered tale of him carried equal parts fear and awe. Jahi, the warrior whose reputation could silence a room without a word. The Apache whose name alone made cowboys draw their guns, and yet, somehow, she was to approach him, tend to his wounds, and survive. Her fingers grazed the map again, tracing the route through the canyon. Dust from the edges fell into the floorboards like tiny motes of warning. She could almost see the jagged rocks, the narrow trails that twisted like serpents, the wind whistling through the gaps in the canyon walls, carrying the scent of sage. "And sun-baked earth. Why me?" she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Her throat burned. "I'm just a healer. I've never faced a—" "The world is changing," he interrupted sharply, leaning forward, eyes like flint. "It's not just bullets that'll keep Dry Creek alive. Sometimes it's hands that can bind a wound or tend a fever. You have a gift, Maribelle, and it's time to use it." Her chest tightened. She had practiced medicine quietly in her small cabin, tending to broken bones, scraped knees, and fevers. But never someone like Jahi. She had never touched a man whose life had been carved by battles, whose every scar told a story no one else had dared to read. The sheriff's gaze didn't waver, and she could feel the weight of every expectation, every fear of the town pressing down on her. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight as if mocking her hesitation, and Maribelle swallowed hard. The fear coiled inside her like a live thing, curling her stomach into knots, but beneath it was a spark, a thread of stubborn courage she hadn't known she possessed. She reached for her leather satchel, worn and patched in several places, filling it with bandages, ointments, and distilled spirits for cleaning wounds. The faint metallic smell of tinctures mixed with the dust in the room. Each item she packed reminded her that this was no ordinary task. Lives, perhaps even hers, depended on her skill and nerve. Stepping out into the morning light, the town seemed unusually silent, the usual clatter of wagons and the hum of voices absent, as if the world itself had paused to watch. She mounted. Her horse, feeling the familiar give of leather against her thighs, and adjusted the reins. Her heart pounded, and she could hear the thrum of her pulse in her ears, echoing the pounding of hooves in some imaginary chase dot as she rode toward the canyon. Dust swirling around her boots, Maribelle knew she was crossing into unknown territory. The stories she'd heard of Jahi's fierceness were no longer tales. They were real, tangible, and waiting for her in the shadowed cliffs ahead. Every sense tingled with anticipation. The smell of sage and dirt, the grit of dust against her skin, the heat of the rising sun pressing against her shoulders. And yet, as fear threatened to root her in place, a quiet determination settled in its place. If she could survive this, if she could tend to him and see what no other eyes had ever dared, she would glimpse a world that existed beyond whispers and shadows, a world that only courage and the willingness to look beyond legend could reveal. The canyon yawned before Maribelle like a beast waiting in shadow, its jagged cliffs etched in the fiery hues of dawn. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, sun-baked earth, and the faint tang of distant gunpowder. Every gust seemed to whisper warnings as her horse's hooves crunched against the gravel-strewn trail. She gripped the reins tighter, feeling the worn leather bite into her palms, and forced herself to focus on the path ahead. One wrong step could mean a twisted ankle. Worse, one wrong glance, one misjudged turn, and she could tumble into a ravine carved over centuries. Her heart hammered in her chest like the hooves beneath her, and every shadow in the canyon seemed to writhe with imagined threats. She kept her eyes on the trail, but the edges of her vision betrayed flickers of movement. A hawk circling high above, the sudden rustle of a lizard darting across sun-bleached rocks. Her stomach knotted. She was alone with the canyon, and with the thought of Jahi, the man whose very name had cowboys whispering in fear. She had prepared herself as best she could. Her satchel was packed meticulously: bandages, clean cloths, distilled spirits for disinfecting wounds, and salve she had painstakingly made herself. Yet the knowledge that none of this guaranteed her survival gnawed at her sharper than any knife. The wind picked up, rattling through narrow crevices, carrying with it the distant howl of coyotes. Maribelle's horse shivered, and she pressed her heels into its flanks, urging it forward. She couldn't help but imagine Jahi lying wounded somewhere in this harsh terrain, each shallow breath a defiance of death, each flicker of pain a challenge she had to meet. The trail twisted dangerously, narrowing as it followed the curve of the canyon. Loose stones skittered beneath the horse's hooves, sending tiny avalanches of gravel tumbling down the slope. Maribelle's hands ached, not from the ride itself, but from the tension that had wrapped around her like a second skin. The sky above was a brilliant canvas of pinks and golds, streaked with clouds that seemed to mirror the turmoil in her chest. She had heard stories about him, tales told in whispers around campfires and saloons. Jahi, the fiercest Apache alive, a warrior whose skills in battle were unmatched, whose eyes could pierce through lies and fear alike. Yet here she was, tasked with approaching him not as an adversary but as a healer. The thought made her stomach twist. Fear and curiosity wrestled within her, an unsteady alliance that propelled her forward as the canyon walls rose higher. Narrowing the trail, Maribelle's thoughts drifted to the injuries he might bear. Arrow wounds, perhaps lacerated. Flesh from gunfire, bruises that ran deep beneath the skin. Each one a silent testament to battle she could only imagine. Her fingers itched to reach into her satchel, to ready her supplies, yet she forced herself to wait, knowing the first step into the unknown required courage, not haste. The wind shifted, carrying a faint metallic scent that made her stomach clench. She leaned forward in the saddle, eyes scanning the rocky walls for movement, any sign of danger. Every rustle of brush, every distant rock slide, made her heart leap, but she rode on. Each hoofbeat a steady drum of determination. Hours seemed to stretch like the canyon itself, endless and unyielding. The sun climbed higher, scorching the earth, and turning the air into a shimmering haze. Sweat dampened her brow, clinging to her hair in dark strands, and the dust from the trail coated her dress like a second skin. But even as exhaustion gnawed at her, she could feel the pull of destiny ahead. This meeting was inevitable, and she could not turn away. Finally, as the sun reached its zenith, a movement caught her eye. A figure leaned against a fallen log. Near a bend in the trail, shadowed but unmistakable. His silhouette was solid, almost statuesque, and she could sense the coiled strength in every line of his body. Jahi, the man of legend, alive and wounded, waiting in the quiet solitude of the canyon. Maribel's chest tightened as she slowed her horse, forcing herself to steady her shaking hands. Dust rose around them in golden motes, catching the sunlight like tiny sparks of magic. Every step forward felt heavier, every breath sharper, but she urged herself onward. The first encounter had arrived, and there would be no turning back. Canyon seemed to hold its breath as she rode closer, the wind stilling as though the land itself waited for what was to come. And in that suspended moment, Maribel understood that she was crossing a threshold not just into the canyon, but into a world of courage, fear, and truths that only those brave enough to witness them could ever hope to see. The wind shifted, carrying a faint tang of smoke and iron, and Maribel's horse slowed to a cautious trot. Her chest heaved, and her fingers trembled slightly on the reins. Ahead, near a fallen log, a figure waited, a presence she could feel in her bones before her eyes fully registered it. The rising sun painted him in gold and shadow, and Maribel's breath caught in her throat. Jahi. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and lean, every muscle defined beneath his bronzed skin. The long black hair that fell past his shoulders shimmered in the sunlight, and tribal jewelry glinted against his chest and arms. His eyes, dark as storm clouds, lifted slowly, scanning her with a calm intensity that made her skin prickle. He was alive and dangerous, and yet there was something in his gaze, curiosity, perhaps even recognition, that froze her in place. Maribel's throat went dry. She swallowed, trying to force her voice out. I've been sent to help. You, she said finally, her words trembling like leaves in the wind. He shifted slightly, leaning on the log, but made no move to rise. His eyes never left hers. Do you fear me? He asked, his voice deep and gravelly, a low rumble that seemed to echo through the canyon walls. Her heart hammered. She could smell the faint metallic tang of blood mixed with sweat and the earthy scent of the canyon around them. Her hands itched to reach into her satchel to ready the bandages, but she hesitated, caught between fear and the strange pull of fascination. I don't know, she admitted, voice barely above a whisper. You've never faced me, he said, finishing her sentence. There was no accusation in his tone, only the quiet weight of truth. Most who try never survive. Why should I? Maribel forced herself to step closer, her boots crunching against the gravel. Each step felt like crossing a chasm she could not see the bottom of. Her fingers grazed the satchel at her side, reminding her of the responsibility she bore. Not just her own life, but his. He might be a warrior, a legend, a man untouchable in the eyes of the world, but now he was wounded, and she was the only one who could help him. Jahi shifted again, allowing her a clearer view of the wound along his shoulder. The torn fabric and dark blood were stark against his skin. The sight made her stomach lurch, but the sight of the man beneath it, the strength, the life etched into every scar, made her resolve harden. She knelt carefully beside him, mindful of every movement. The scent of sage, blood, and dust filled her nostrils, grounding her in the moment. He didn't flinch as her hands hovered over the injury. Instead, he watched her with an intensity that seemed to measure her courage, her intentions. Slowly, deliberately, she unrolled her bandages, dipped cloth into distilled spirits, and began to clean the wound. The sharp sting of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the smell of sun-baked canyon walls. Jahi gritted his teeth, his breathing steady, letting her work out as she pressed the cloth to his skin. She noticed the small details, the way his fingers flexed unconsciously, the subtle tension in his jaw, the slow rise and fall of his chest. Every scar on his body told a story. Battles fought, hardships endured, victories won, and lives lost. Yet beneath the warrior's exterior, there was something raw and unspoken, a humanity few had the courage to see. "You're brave," he said quietly, almost as if testing the sound of the words. Not many would come this close. Maribel's hands shook slightly, but her voice was steady. "I'm here to heal," she said. "That's all I can do." He studied her a long moment, then nodded slightly, a gesture of trust that surprised her more than his words ever could. She worked on, cleaning the wound, pressing the cloth with careful precision, tending to the warrior who had inspired both fear and awe across the plains. And in that quiet canyon, surrounded by jagged cliffs and the scent of earth and sage, Maribelle realized something profound. She was seeing Jahi in a way no one else ever had, not as a legend, not as a threat, but as a man in pain, a man alive, a man who, perhaps, could be saved by hands that others feared to extend. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the canyon floor. The air shimmered with heat, and every sense in Maribel's body was heightened. The crunch of gravel beneath her knees, the metallic scent of blood, the warmth radiating from his body, the rhythmic breathing that echoed against the stone. Fear and awe mingled in a strange, fragile alliance, and she knew this encounter would mark her forever. For the first time, she understood that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was the willingness to face what others would not, to touch the untouchable, to see the invisible. And as she continued her work, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world beyond the canyon was waiting for the story she would carry from this day forward. Night had fallen over the canyon, draping the jagged rocks in shades of indigo and gray. The last rays of sun had vanished behind the cliffs, leaving only the whisper of wind through the sagebrush and the faint crackle of a small campfire that Maribelle had coaxed to life. Shadows danced across the uneven canyon floor, flickering like ghostly shapes that seemed to watch her every move. Her hands were steady, though her heart still pounded in her chest, echoing the rhythm of the wind that swept through the crevices. Jahi leaned back against a boulder, the firelight catching the curves of his muscles and the glint of his tribal jewelry. His long black hair tumbled over his shoulders, and though he was quiet, his presence filled the space with an almost tangible tension. Maribelle worked diligently, cleaning and rebandaging his wounds, her fingers moving with precision honed through years of tending the sick and injured. The metallic tang of blood mingled with the earthy scent of smoke and sage, creating an aroma that clung to the canyon walls and made the night feel alive. As she worked, Maribelle noticed something unexpected. Beneath his arm, partially hidden by a fold in his blanket, lay small, worn fragments of paper. She hesitated, unsure if she should disturb them, but curiosity overcame caution. She carefully unfolded one. The letters were written in a delicate hand, the ink faded but still legible. Names, places, and dates spilled across the page, along with words that hinted at betrayal, love, and loss. Maribel's breath caught. These were not the words of a warrior hardened only by battle. They belonged to a man who had lived, who had loved, and who had been wounded in ways far deeper than the flesh she tended. She felt a pang of guilt for intruding, yet the desire to understand him was stronger. Jahi shifted slightly, noticing her gaze. "Curiosity will be your undoing," he said, his voice low, more amused than threatening. "You should not read what was never meant for your eyes." I didn't mean to pry," Maribelle said, lowering the paper slowly. I see so many scars on you, and I wonder how a man can carry all of them and still stand." For the first time, Jahi's lips curved into something like a smile, brief and fleeting. "Not all scars are visible," he murmured. "Some are carved into the soul, and they weigh heavier than any wound I've carried in battle." Maribelle nodded, understanding more than she could say. She worked in silence for a few minutes, letting the fire crackle between them. Each flicker of flame revealed a new detail. The way his eyes softened when he thought no one was watching, the tension in his hands as he unconsciously flexed them, the way his breathing became steady and measured as if he were rehearsing control over the pain that surely lingered beneath the surface. Finally, she dared to speak again. "Did someone betray you?" Her voice was barely a whisper, lost amid the wind that sighed through the canyon. Jahi single quotes, S gaze turned inward, dark eyes reflecting the firelight. "Yes," he said quietly, "once long ago. I trusted, and I was left with nothing but ashes and echoes." His jaw tightened, the muscles working under bronzed skin. "That is why I fight, why I survive. I cannot let weakness define me." Maribel's hands hovered over his arm again, hesitating. The warrior before her was more than the legend. The man was a labyrinth of pain, courage, and secrets. Every wound she treated felt like an attempt to mend more than just flesh. And every story he shared in fragments of words, gestures, and glances added to the tapestry of a life that few had the courage to witness. Night deepened, and the canyon grew colder. Maribelle wrapped a clean blanket around his shoulders, careful not to touch the wounds directly with her ungloved hands. The scent of her hair, mingled with the smoke from the fire and the faint earthy tang of his skin, created a strange intimacy that made her pulse quicken. In that quiet, shadowed space, she realized she was no longer just a healer tending a legendary warrior. She had become a witness.
Witness to a man's pain, his resilience, his humanity.
The kind of witness that changed not only the observed but the observer. The fire crackled one last time, sending sparks dancing into the cool night air. Jahi's gaze met hers, unflinching and sharp, and for a fleeting moment, the canyon seemed to disappear, leaving only two people standing at the edge of understanding, one wounded in body, the other in awe, both discovering truths no one else had dared to see. And Maribelle knew, with an unshakable certainty, that this night would haunt her forever, not for fear, but for the revelation of what lay hidden beneath legend, waiting for someone brave enough to witness it. The wind rose suddenly, howling through the canyon like a living thing, shaking the thin walls of Maribel's small camp. Dust and loose stones swirled around her horse's hooves as she hurried to gather what remained of her supplies. The sky darkened rapidly, clouds rolling in with unnatural speed, blotting out the golden sunlight that had bathed the canyon only hours before. Thunder growled in the distance, low and threatening, vibrating through the rocky ground beneath her boots. Jahi stirred beside the fire, muscles taut even as he leaned against the boulder, watching her with calm eyes that somehow seemed to pierce through the storm before it even arrived. His long black hair whipped in the rising wind, tribal jewelry glinting sporadically when lightning split the sky. "We must move," he said simply, voice steady, gravelly, carrying the weight of experience that Maribelle could only imagine. Ran her horse's hooves pounding against the rocky trail, Jahi's long strides matching them as he helped guide the animal through sudden slick patches of mud and wet gravel. Rain began to fall in heavy sheets, soaking her dress, plastering her hair to her face. The canyon walls echoed the storm, creating a symphony of wind, rock, and distant thunderclaps. Every step was treacherous. One slip could send them tumbling into the jagged rocks below. Finally, they found shelter in a narrow cave carved by centuries of wind and water. Inside, the air was cool and damp, earthy with the scent of stone and minerals. Maribelle hurriedly laid out her satchel and supplies, hands shaking from both cold and adrenaline. Jahi leaned back against the cave wall, wet, but composed, muscles glistening in the dim light filtering from the cave entrance. She could see every scar, every taut muscle, every line of his body that told stories of battles survived. "You must rest," she said, voice firm though her hands trembled slightly. "I cannot work if you keep moving." "I cannot sit idle," he replied quietly, eyes dark and stormy like the sky outside. "Pain teaches as much as rest. I must endure." Maribelle forced herself to ignore the chill seeping through her soaked dress and focused on the wound along his shoulder. Blood and dirt mixed into a dark smear across bronzed skin. She cleaned it carefully, dipping cloth into distilled spirits, the sharp smell stinging her nose. The metallic scent of blood mingled with the damp earth of the cave, creating a heady, almost suffocating atmosphere. Jahi's breathing was steady, controlled, yet the subtle flex of his fingers betrayed the sting of pain. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the jagged interior of the cave, casting their shadows large and twisted against the walls. Maribelle's hands were steady, but her heart pounded with every crack of thunder. She pressed the cloth gently against his skin, watching for any sign of discomfort, her own pulse syncing with the rhythm of the storm outside. "You are unlike anyone I've ever encountered," Jahi said, voice low, almost drowned by the rain pounding against the cave entrance. "Most who approach fear me. They flee at the sight of blood, the scent of pain." Maribelle's lips parted, unsure what to say, but the truth burned bright within her. "I don't fear you," she admitted, "because I see more than the warrior. I see the man beneath the legend." His gaze softened for the briefest instant, and she felt the weight of unspoken trust settle between them. The storm roared on outside, shaking the very walls of the cave, yet inside there was a strange pocket of stillness, an intimacy born from shared danger, shared vulnerability, and the recognition that life was fragile and fleeting. Hours passed, the rain thrumming against the rocks in an endless, hypnotic rhythm. Maribelle's hands worked tirelessly, bandaging, applying ointments, and checking for infection, while Jahi shared fragments of stories in halting English, tales of lost kin, battles fought, and the harsh lessons of survival in a land that demanded both strength and cunning. And in the heart of that storm, surrounded by darkness, wet stone, and the wild roar of nature, Maribelle realized something profound. Courage was not only about facing bullets or blood. It was about staying, about seeing, about touching life and humanity when the world told her turn away. By the time the storm began to wane, leaving a pale light filtering through the cave entrance, Jahi's wound was stabilized and his breathing deep and steady. Outside, the canyon glistened with rain, the air crisp and clean. And Maribelle knew that she had survived not only the storm itself, but the terrifying intimacy of tending to a man who had lived and fought where few dared to tread. For the first time, she saw Jahi not as a legend or a weapon, but as a man who could endure, a man who could trust, and a man whose story she would carry with her forever. Days passed, and the canyon seemed to transform under the rising sun, its jagged rocks softened by golden light and the occasional bloom of desert flowers. Maribelle had grown accustomed to the rhythm of life beside Jahi, though the weight of responsibility never eased. Each day she cleaned wounds, applied salves, and carefully monitored his recovery. Yet she began to realize her role extended far beyond tending flesh. She was now a witness to a man whose story had been carved into the earth and etched into every scar he bore. Jahi moved with a strength that belied his injuries. His muscles rippled under bronzed skin as he lifted logs, adjusted camp, or practiced simple stretches in the early morning sun. Tribal jewelry necklaces, leather armbands, and feathers glimmered with each movement. Despite his recovery, he remained alert, his dark eyes scanning the canyon as if danger could spring from every shadow. Maribelle followed him carefully, learning to read the signs he noticed: subtle shifts in the wind, distant echoes, footprints in the dust. "You are learning quickly," he said one morning, his voice low and rough like gravel. They had been walking a narrow ledge overlooking the canyon floor, wind tugging at her hair and dress. Few notice what others overlook. It is useful, sometimes life-saving, to see beyond the obvious. Maribelle swallowed, feeling the tension of the canyon trail under her boots. I just watch. I want to understand. I want to help." "Help requires trust," he replied, stopping to point toward a cluster of rocks below. "To heal me, you must see everything. Fear makes the hands falter, the heart hesitate. You have courage, yet you hesitate." His words pressed against her chest, heavier than any stone she had carried. She realized that this task was no longer just about mending cuts or cleaning blood. It was about bridging the gap between legend and humanity. Jahi's story was one of pain and survival, and she was becoming part of it simply by being present. That evening, as the sun sank behind the canyon cliffs, painting the sky in streaks of crimson and gold, danger arrived. A small band of raiders, drawn by rumors of a wounded Apache, approached the canyon floor. Dust rose like smoke, and the faint clatter of hooves and shouted commands carried upward. Maribel's pulse quickened, and she glanced at Jahi. His expression was unreadable, yet his body coiled with tension, ready to act. "You must hide," he said, voice quiet but commanding. "Stay behind the rocks, watch, and do not intervene unless I call." She nodded, heart hammering as she ducked behind a boulder. Her hands gripped her satchel, ready to assist, but aware that her safety and his trust depended on her obedience. From her vantage point, she watched Jahi move like a shadow, fluid and precise. The raiders, expecting an easy target, were met with strategy and instinct honed over decades. Jahi fought not recklessly, but with calculated skill, anticipating their movements, dodging, and countering in ways that made Maribel's breath catch in awe and fear. When the last of the raiders fled, defeated and bewildered, Maribelle emerged, slowly scanning the canyon for injuries. Jahi stood alone, chest rising and falling steadily, sweat glistening on his skin, eyes still sharp, gaze meeting hers with a silent acknowledgement. "You did well," he said simply. "You watched. You did not falter. That is the difference between fear and courage." Maribelle felt a surge of pride and relief, but also a strange intimacy. Trust had been tested, and she had passed not with words, but with presence, attentiveness, and patience. She realized she was no longer just a healer. She was part of his world, part of his survival, and he had allowed her to witness a side of life that few had ever seen. The canyon settled into quiet once more, shadows stretching long under the moonlight. Maribelle sat beside Jahi, hands still, tingling from adrenaline, and felt the enormity of the connection forming between them. They had survived storms, wounds, and danger together, and in doing so, had forged a bond built on trust, respect, and the courage to see beyond legend into the heart of a man. For the first time, Maribelle understood that her presence mattered, not because she wielded skill or strength alone, but because she had dared to witness and endure the truths that the world often refused to see. And Jahi, for his part, allowed that witness to stand beside him, silent but unwavering, a testament to the fragile, unspoken trust between them. The canyon was quiet in the early morning, bathed in pale gold as the sun crested the jagged cliffs. The night's storm had left the earth glistening, every rock and crevice catching the light, sparkling with droplets of rain. Maribelle sat, cross-legged on a flat boulder, brushing damp hair from her face, her satchel beside her. Jahi stood a few paces away, shirtless and powerful as ever, his long black hair falling over bronze shoulders, tribal jewelry glinting with the morning light. The wounds that had brought them together were healed or at least stabilized, but the bond they shared went far deeper than flesh. For days, she had witnessed the warrior's strength and vulnerability, his legend and his humanity. Now, as the canyon breathed quietly around them, Jahi turned to face her fully, his eyes softening in a way that no one else had ever seen. "You have seen much," he said, voice low and even, yet carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Not just my wounds, not just my scars." Maribel's chest tightened. "I have," she whispered. "And I've learned that courage isn't always in the fight, it's in choosing to see the truth, even when it terrifies you." He nodded slowly, the corners of his lips tugging into the faintest hint of a smile. "Most people see only legend or fear. Few have eyes to witness what lies beneath. You," his voice faltered for a moment, uncharacteristically vulnerable. "You have seen me." The canyon seemed to hold its breath around them. The wind stilled, the distant birds silent, as if the world itself acknowledged the gravity of that admission. Maribel felt a warmth in her chest, a recognition of something rare and fragile, trust earned and given freely, untainted by fear or expectation. She began, searching for words that felt inadequate. "I never thought I would be part of something so alive, so dangerous, and yet so honest." Jahi stepped closer, the light catching the lines of his torso, the curve of muscles hardened by years of survival. His gaze softened further. "You have courage? Not of the body, but of the heart. That is why you were here. That is why I allowed you." Silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. The canyon walls glimmered with wet stone, and Maribel felt the pulse of life that had always run beneath the legend of Jahi, the heartbeat of a man who had endured battles, betrayal, and solitude, now tempered by the quiet presence of a witness. She reached into her satchel, producing the small fragments of paper she had found earlier, the letters, the maps, the stories. He took them carefully, studying the faded ink with a reverence that made her realize these were more than relics. They were pieces of a life no one else had dared to touch. "These are my truths," he said quietly, "and now they are yours as well. You will carry them beyond this canyon, beyond legend, into a world that rarely listens." Maribel nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settle upon her shoulders. "I will," she promised. "I will tell the world what I saw, what you truly are." For a moment they stood in silence, connected not by words, but by the recognition that each had witnessed the other in a way no one else could. And then, as the first rays of sunlight broke fully over the canyon, Jahi turned and began to move toward the cliff's edge, muscles rippling with strength and fluidity. "You must go," he said over his shoulder. "The canyon will not keep me forever. You have your life to live." Maribel rose, adjusting her satchel, her fingers brushing against the smooth leather that had held her tools, her memories, and her courage. She watched him, every step deliberate, every movement controlled and powerful. "Will I ever see you again?" she asked, her voice barely above the whisper of wind through the cliffs. "Perhaps," he said, pausing to glance back once, a glimmer of a smile tugging at his lips. "Perhaps when the world allows it." With that, he disappeared along the ridge, leaving Maribel standing alone on the canyon floor. Yet she did not feel abandoned. She felt privileged. She had been trusted. She had witnessed the untold. And she carried a story that no one else could ever tell, not fully, not honestly, not without her presence beside it. Maribel took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of rain-washed earth and sage. The canyon seemed to exhale with her, alive with secrets, courage, and the enduring presence of a man whose legend would forever be entwined with her own. And as she began her journey back to the world beyond the cliffs, she knew that she had seen what no other eyes had ever dared.